Good afternoon, and welcome to the third webinar in the Accelerated Learning Summer Webinar Series. Our presenter this afternoon is Dr. Nancy Nelson-Fien. Nancy is an assistant professor of special education at Wheelock College of Education and Human Development at Boston University. Her research focuses on developing and evaluating math and reading interventions for grades K through 8th. She's a nationally certified school psychologist and a former middle and high school special education math teacher. We are honored to welcome Dr. Nancy Nelson-Fien for today's webinar.
Thanks, Melissa. Good afternoon, everyone. As Melissa noted, I am going to talk to you today about assessment practices for acceleration. And we're going to focus first on some guiding principles that we should consider when we're thinking about assessment for acceleration, the types of assessment that we can use to accelerate student learning, considerations that we want to attend to for different age groups, and I'll share some additional resources related to assessment and intervention. So first and foremost, when we're thinking about assessment targets in school contexts, I want to take a step back and think about the broad landscape of assessment. And there are different types of assessment data that we use. Importantly, implementation data are a large focus of our school work and school systems. So that includes systems level implementation data that allow us to examine the features of our system that are in place, those that aren't, so that we can identify where we want to prioritize our efforts and professional development in our school settings. There's also classroom level implementation data that gives us information about fidelity of implementation and levels of evidence-based practices that are being implemented in those classrooms. There are a number of established tools for those areas of implementation. I'm talking about this only because it's not a focus of the presentation today, and I don't want anyone to overlook that those data are also very necessary if we're thinking about accelerating learning for students. Today, however, we're focused on student performance data as an assessment target. That includes diagnostic, formative, and summative measures. So assessment guiding principles that I really want, if you take anything away from the presentation, I want you to remember these guiding principles related to assessment for accelerating student learning. And the first of these is that the time and resources that are allocated to student assessment are only worth spending when you're using the assessment to answer a specific question and the data from the assessment are used for their intended purpose. So if you don't know why you're assessing, if you're not going to look at the data, it's a waste of time to be doing that. We want to make sure that we're very purposeful in using our assessments. Another important guiding principle for assessment for acceleration is that the higher the stakes of the decision that you're making, the greater the demand on the psychometric properties of that assessment. So if I'm making a low stakes decision, I don't have to worry quite as much about the psychometric properties. But if I'm making a high stakes decision, I really need to attend to making sure that the assessment has been validated for the purpose for which I'm going to use it. Another guiding principle is that assessment doesn't take the place of a good curriculum. So while we're talking about assessment for acceleration, it's not as though I can assess students and expect that they're going to grow. Assessment is the tool through which we measure student learning, but it doesn't matter how often we assess students if the instruction that they're receiving is poor. So throughout the presentation today, I make some links between assessment and intervention, or assessment and instruction, because that's the purpose of assessment in school settings, large in part to inform the instructional efforts that we are putting in place. And last guiding principle related to assessment for acceleration is that the level of intensity of assessment should match the level of intensity of an instruction and intervention in your school system. So if I am not providing very intensive instruction or intervention, I'm going to assess less than if I'm providing more intensive instruction and intervention, so that I can measure that more intensive instruction and intervention in terms of its impact on student learning and be able to make instructional adjustments. If we're investing additional resources in instruction and intervention, we want to make sure that those efforts are paying off. When we think about our assessments and psychometric properties, there are a set of standards that govern or guide what assessments should look like. So these standards are continuously improved. They're developed by experts. The standards for educational and psychological testing, for example, are jointly developed and revised by the American Educational Research Association, the American Psychological Association, and the National Council on Measurement and Education. For measurement experts in education, who are often those involved in creating assessments, they adhere pretty strictly to these principles. In addition, there are governing bodies or sort of guiding agencies that tell us about the quality of assessments. So when you're thinking about whether or not an assessment is strong or valid or has good psychometric properties, you can look to these independent reviews. These are reviews that are done not by the publishers or the creators of the measures themselves, but they're by independent bodies like the National Center on Intensive Intervention and the What Works Clearinghouse, for example, are two agencies that review assessments and give you information about their properties and their quality. And then also we know that our assessments should be current. So we want to use assessments that have been updated relatively recently for numerous reasons. One being that there's been a change in the education landscape in terms of the learning standards and initiatives that states and our country are focused on. So, for example, we have the Common Core state standards that numerous states still adhere to. In Michigan, local to you, you have the Top 10 in 10 Years initiative, which is guiding educational practice in terms of what assessment should focus on, what best practice looks like. We want to make sure that we're using assessments that reflect those changes, along with changing demographics that we've seen in our country, to make sure that our samples, norm samples that give us sort of the basis for some of our psychometric properties are informed by those demographic data. When we talk about technical adequacy in psychometrics, it can get kind of complicated. You know, if you're not a measurement expert, some of these terms seem a little bit overwhelming. The most commonly discussed terms that you're probably familiar with are reliability and validity. There are numerous others that we think about depending on the type of assessment and the purpose of that assessment. But these psychometrics broadly tell us about the quality of an assessment across numerous dimensions. And the psychometrics tell us, if we have an assessment tool that has strong psychometric properties, it tells us that we can make decisions from those assessments that are defensible and data-based. If the assessment does not have strong psychometric properties, then the defensibility of our decision is much less, because it's based much more on our own professional judgment instead of something that's been established and validated. And again, when we're making a high stakes decision, for example, special education eligibility decisions or decisions about graduation or promotion, we have to use assessments with high levels of technical adequacy or very strong psychometric properties. That's the only way that those decisions are defensible and actionable. I should also note these infographics here are all available from the National Center on Improving Literacy, which I provide a link to at the very end of this presentation. And they're very user-friendly in terms of describing these psychometric properties and giving some examples that are more concrete for users. So how do we use these psychometrics then? If we're saying that we need to use assessments that have technical adequacy evidence, not all assessments do. So does that mean that all assessments I use must have been rigorously evaluated and validated for a purpose? Not necessarily. I'll explain why in a moment. Does this mean all assessments I use must have been published? So they're established, existing, widely available. I can purchase them from somewhere, or maybe get them freely available. Not necessarily. Again, I'll explain. In all cases, it's preferable to use the best assessment available to answer the question you're trying to answer. So it doesn't always mean you have to use a measure that's been rigorously evaluated, because sometimes there isn't a measure available for you for the purpose for which you're trying to use it. Doesn't mean it has to be a published measure necessarily. In low stakes situations in particular, so for example, for a teacher trying to figure out on a daily basis whether students learned what she taught that day, teacher-created assessments or others that don't have established technical adequacy are just fine to use. However, the caveat to that is anytime we're using a non-validated assessment measure, we can't defensively compare progress between or within students. So if I'm trying to look at whether or not a student has made progress over time, or whether student A has made progress relative to student B or relative to an established standard, I'm not going to be able to do that with a non-standardized, non-validated assessment measure. And so you really need to think again about the purpose of the assessment and the questions you're trying to answer when you're choosing this particular assessment you will use. We have 4 different types of assessment that I'm going to talk about here. This should be a review, I would expect for most of you, but I will also hover on a couple of important points related to these measures. Screening assessments are measures that are typically brief, they're standardized, they're norm referenced, and they're intended to be indicators of highly predictive later outcomes. And so they're essentially a measure of risk. So we use screening assessments just like we use a thermometer or a scale for weight. Those are things, your temperature and your weight we know are indicators of overall health. And so we measure those things as a way of screening whether or not there are any difficulties or problems. That is true for screening measures also. And I often hear feedback in the field about using screening assessments that don't align with instruction. So the very specific skills that are being assessed in the screening measure are not the same as those that are being taught in the classroom. And although I understand that conceptually, that's not actually a concern because our screening measures are just telling us about risk. So if we're just using a measure to identify students for tiers of support or to place students sort of strategically in levels, that screening assessment doesn't need to measure what I'm going to teach on Monday because it's measuring something that we've validated this measure to be predictive of later on. So in reading, for example, we have screening assessments that are fluency-based measures, and certainly you're not teaching students just to be fluent in reading in your reading classrooms. But these measures that are brief, they're 1-minute probes, fluency measures, they are highly predictive of overall reading achievement at the end of a grade level. And that is what makes those measures a good screening assessment because they tell you who's at risk in a very brief, quick, fast indicator-like way. They tell you very quickly who is at risk for not meeting that standard at the end of the year if you don't provide a supplemental intervention and support for those students. So that's a very important point about screening specifically. Diagnostic assessments are different from screening assessments. And so we don't use a screening assessment as a diagnostic assessment. A diagnostic assessment does tell us and should be related to the instruction that students are going to receive in the classroom. So it's more comprehensive. It's going to measure in depth what the skills that students have related to the content that is about to be taught, so that the teacher can better figure out where they need to start with instruction when an instructional starting point isn't already known or established. A progress measure is another type of formative assessment. These are typically brief, repeated measures that measure instructional content standards that are being taught. So this includes progress monitoring measures or mastery tests that directly inform the subsequent instruction or at least adjustments to the instruction that you're delivering. Summative assessments are really in contrast to the other 3 assessment types listed here in that they're intended to be a sort of after-the-fact measure. And so these are mastery or end-of-year tests that assess the range of content that students are expected to have learned. They can be used to inform instruction, but it's in a much less formative way. It's really an overall measure of how well the instruction or the system worked to support students to master the learning objectives that are targeted. Some common examples of these measures, and I have another caveat here and note that I'm giving you some examples irrespective of their quality for these purposes. So I'm not telling you any of these assessments are good or bad, just that they're commonly used for these different types in school settings. For screening, some screening assessments that you might have heard of or be familiar with include iReady, iStation, the STAR assessment, FastBridge, EasyCBM, DIBELS, the MAP assessment, or AIMSweb. Diagnostic assessments include things like the GMAID, the GRADE, the DRA, the ADAM. So these are assessments that these happen to be standardized examples of diagnostic assessments that have been published and created teacher-created diagnostic assessments based on the curriculum, or curriculum diagnostic assessments may be available as well. Those are, again, are assessments that are telling you about what students know related to the specific content that's going to be taught to support decisions about instructional placement. Progress assessments include many of our screening assessments, and I'll comment on that in a second. So FastBridge, again, Easy CBM, DIBELS, Ames Wet, potentially teacher-created mastery tests. And these assessments are proximal to the content being taught, because the standards that they're, or that the specific content that they're assessing happens to be aligned with specific skills that are frequently targeted in intervention. And we use progress monitors most regularly when we're intervening, rather than administering those to all students, going back to that guiding principle of matching our assessment intensity to our intervention intensity. Summative measures are things like curriculum embedded unit test, smarter balance assessment, any of the consortium assessments that have been adopted by states, other state assessments are all summative assessments that we frequently use in school settings. So in our school system, as I am hitting home, our intensity of assessment matches our intensity of intervention. And so we use, in a sort of school system structure and a multi-tiered system of support, or thinking about even a tiered instructional system, we have a universal level of prevention. We expect that in a healthy system where things are running smoothly, that 80% of students will need that universal level of support. Another roughly 15% will need a targeted level of prevention or intervention, tier 2 support. And then approximately 3 to 5% will need intensive intervention, even in a healthy system, in sort of a tier 3 context. Our assessment matches that. So screening measures are administered to all students across the system so that we can evaluate risk for content difficulties and disabilities, and place students into tiers of support. And then our progress monitoring and mastery tests are frequently just used for those students that are in some type of supplemental or intensive intervention, to monitor the effectiveness of that support and inform adjustments to that support. Of course, diagnostic and summative assessment might be used in this system as well. Summative assessments are frequently used. Diagnostic assessments might be necessary in cases where we need to inform instructional placement. So I'm going to pause here. I want you to consider independently for just 30 seconds or so, why is formative assessment compared to summative assessment so important in supporting acceleration of student learning? So take a moment and think about that. I'll say the question one more time. Why is formative assessment versus summative assessment so important in supporting acceleration of student learning? Primarily, formative assessment provides actionable data that we know can be used in a timely fashion, and it's a means of preventing further risk and progress flattening or decline. So that formative assessment that we use, generally speaking, it's our diagnostic, our progress measures, our potentially, or definitely our screening measures. Those are all used as a way of informing what we're going to do, using data to make adjustments to our instruction and intervention, so that we don't wait until the end of the year or longer to find out that students didn't master what we've taught them, which would obviously put them further behind. In particular, in the context that we're dealing with right now, when students have been out of school or haven't had access to good instruction, every day of instruction is extremely important for accelerating student learning. So thinking about some considerations for different grade levels, I'm going to describe some for elementary school and then for middle and high school, and give you a case example for each about what this might look like in practice. In elementary school, best practice indicates that established, widely available universal screening assessments are used to place students in flexibly implemented tiers of support, meaning that these placement decisions, placing students into tiers of support, aren't intended to be permanent. Students are expected to move across those tiers of support as need indicates based on our data. After we screen students and place them into tiers of support in elementary school, we provide instruction in tiers 1 and 2 that's informed by curriculum standards and also our screening data to the extent that the screening data do happen to be instructionally relevant. Instruction in tier 3 and beyond might require diagnostic assessment at this stage to inform what that tier 3 intervention is going to look like and what it's going to focus on. Students receiving supplemental tier 2 and tier 3 or intensive interventions have their progress monitored at regular intervals to support opportunities to adjust instruction and maximize acceleration of learning. And again, that's sort of this avoiding a wait to fail approach or a wait to fall further behind approach. We want to use those data formatively to revise, refine our instruction and intervention to ensure that students are learning. And then all students are rescreened in the winter and spring to revisit student tier assignment and document the effectiveness of tier 1 support. So we don't want to make the assumption at the beginning of the year that students who are placed in tier 1 only need tier 1 for the rest of the year, because we don't know how effective that tier 1 support will be. We don't know if there are other things that will impact student skills. And so we want to make sure that we rescreen to have data to inform a decision about whether or not that student might need all of a sudden tier 2 or tier 3 support. Also give us some information about how well tier 1 is working for all students. If all of our students started the year only needing tier 1 and at the middle of the year are now needing tier 2 and tier 3 based on the data, that's telling us that our tier 1 instruction is not meeting what our expectations, that it needs to be better, and that we need to focus actually on improving the quality of tier 1 for all of those students. So I'm going to give you a case example now of what this looks like and could look like in elementary school. This is just one example of many that follows these assessment principles. So Anna here is a 6-year-old first grade student in Baltimore, Maryland. Her school uses as their universal screening assessment system, Dibble's 8th edition. And at her school, they screen all students for reading difficulties 3 times per year, in September, in January, and in May. On the fall screening assessment, Anna's composite score, so her overall score on the assessment, is in the at-risk range. And if you're not familiar with Dibble's, there are 3 or 4 levels. Dibble's 8th edition happens to have 4 levels: at risk, some risk, minimal risk, and negligible risk. So essentially from most at risk to least at risk. So Anna's composite score in this case is at some risk. And so it's a little bit in the middle. It's not the completely at risk, but it's at some risk. But that tells us that she's in need of intervention. It tells us that she is not on track to meet grade level expectations in reading at the end of the school year. When we more closely look at her screening data across the different measures that, in the case of Dibble's 8th edition, are aligned with the 5 big ideas of reading, which we know are instructional targets, even though these are fluency-based measures, it tells us that she's at minimal risk for letter naming fluency. So that's not really letter naming is not a concern. It's not an instructional target. It's not an instructional side note. It's not an instructional target anyway in the early grades because it's a predictor measure. Phoneme segmentation fluency, she is at risk on that measure. She's at risk on nonsense word fluency. So again, that band is the most at risk. She's at some risk on word reading fluency, and she's at minimal risk on oral reading fluency. So a little bit all over the place, but looking at these scores disaggregated give us some information about where we can start instruction and where we should prioritize based on knowing what big ideas these measures map onto. And so phoneme segmentation fluency is a measure of phonemic awareness. Nonsense word fluency is a measure of the alphabetic principle, or sort of phonics. And so we know that those are major targets and areas of focus for Anna in her intervention support that she's going to receive. When the school in their multi-tier system of support, or MTSS, data team meeting meets to review the data, based on the available resources in the system, knowing how many students are at risk in that particular system, the team decides that Anna will receive Tier 1 instruction with all students using the district adopted core reading program plus enhanced core reading instruction, which is a systemic intervention that enhances the core reading program to more explicitly teach the 5 big ideas of reading. And because Anna is struggling in reading, she's in the some risk range. She has some significant risk related to phonemic awareness and phonics. She's going to get a foundational reading skills intervention that's aligned with her Tier 1 instruction. In this case, it's the ECRI Tier 2 intervention, again, which is aligned and also pre-teaches foundational reading skills so that Anna is better able to access Tier 1 instruction. And that is, she receives that intervention in Tier 2 focused on content using the same procedures as she will see the subsequent day in Tier 1. And so that supports Anna's success. I want to pause and reflect here before we move on to additional parts of this, what this looks like in the school setting, and see if you picked up on one thing. So note that no additional assessment beyond the screening assessment was needed to determine Anna's instruction and intervention plan. Again, no additional assessment, so no diagnostic assessment, was needed beyond the screening assessment to determine Anna's instruction and intervention plan. Why might that be? I want you to take, again, 30 seconds and think about that, and we'll talk about it. Well, I'll talk about it. So in first grade, we know very well what we need to teach to support students' reading skill development. That's what part and parcel principle number 1. 2, the holes that Anna might have in her reading skills are not difficult to identify. As a first grader, the exposure to content that she's had relative to what she's expected to demonstrate is pretty well matched. So she may have some things that she hasn't learned, but there aren't going to be so many holes that it's warranted to give a diagnostic assessment that's going to probably take at least 30, 45 minutes of instruction in order to administer that assessment and gather data that we don't really need. We know, again, because we know what to teach very well in first grade, we have a lot of intervention programs that are evidence-based, like the ECRI program, that can be used to teach the skills that Anna needs to be taught without engaging in this additional assessment. That may not be true for a student that's much, much further behind than Anna. In first grade, it probably still is true, but as students get older, we see that they do have more holes in their skills, and that diagnostic assessment is more useful for supporting instruction and intervention efforts. So going back to our case example, because Anna is in need of and receiving supplemental intervention, her progress is monitored on a regular basis in a couple of ways. First, during each lesson, her interventionist, who is a trained instructional assistant, collects mastery data. And so the interventionist, while Anna is practicing the content, she's monitoring, writing down the errors that Anna is making with particular skills so that she can use those data. Then biweekly, her school monitors her progress using DIBELS 8th edition, but they're not going to administer all of the DIBELS 8th edition measures for Anna because her skill needs are really in 2 to 3 areas. And so we're going to start with sort of those that she's working on most. So we're focusing on those where she's having the greatest difficulty based on the screening assessment. And those areas, again, are phonemic awareness and phonics. So we're going to use the phoneme segmentation fluency and the nonsense word fluency progress monitoring probes to monitor her progress on a biweekly way. We don't, in some cases, you might even be able to stretch out the frequency of this progress monitoring. So that's maybe every 2 to 3 weeks or maybe monthly. Again, we want the frequency of our data collection, our progress monitoring, the effort that we're putting into our assessment to match the intensity of the intervention that is being received. These data are used, right? So she's in need of intervention. She's getting that intervention. So we're assessing her progress, and we're using those data to inform adjustments to instruction. So this also happens in a couple of ways. First, at the end of each lesson, the interventionist is using those lesson mastery data to provide additional instruction and practice. So by knowing which errors Anna has made in the lesson, the interventionist can go back to the particular instruction that was being delivered and use some of those things that she's struggling with as a way to engage Anna in additional instruction and support with those fine skills that she's struggling with. On a weekly basis, that interventionist is examining error patterns. So if she's continuing to have the same difficulty across the week, the interventionist is using those data to do more reteaching if that's necessary. And then biweekly, the grade level data team, where the interventionist is also a member, they review her Anna's DIBELS progress monitoring data and also mastery data to make decisions about instructional adjustments, considering all of those data sources. If she's not making progress, they might change attributes of the intervention to increase its intensity or to alter the particular practice opportunities or particular instructional strategies that are being used to make sure that that progress is increasing. Finally, as part of this approach, in January, Anna's rescreened using DIBELS 8th edition along with all of the other students in her school, again, to make sure that those students who are only receiving Tier 1 are also making progress, along with the students that are receiving Tier 1 plus, Tier 2, or Tier 3. On the winter screening assessment, in this case, Anna's composite score is in the some risk range, indicating that she continues to need intervention, but that her learning has been accelerated since the fall. And I think I misspoke on the earlier slide. She was at risk in the fall, but close to the some risk range. So in this case, she's moved up. Her composite score has improved, which is telling us that she's getting less at risk for not meeting that end of year grade level goal. When we look at her winter screening data, again, sort of disaggregating and looking at what's there, she's at minimal risk on both letter naming fluency and phoneme segmentation fluency. So she's made some progress in the area of phonemic awareness. She's at some risk on nonsense word fluency, word reading fluency, and oral reading fluency. So in this case, her risk has gone down for nonsense word fluency. So she's improved her phonics skills. But now she's at some risk on two measures that she wasn't at risk before. And a lot of times people have questions about these kinds of things when you start drilling down and looking at data. Again, if you're drilling down and looking at data, you want to make sure that the assessment that you're using has been validated for that purpose. In this case, DIBELS 8th edition is. And people might have questions in this particular example about why Anna would be all of a sudden at risk for word reading fluency and at risk on oral reading fluency. Like, does that mean that the intervention and instruction isn't working? And if you take a step back and think about how these measures work and how instruction works and should work in school settings, that's actually following a normal pattern. And so for a student who's struggling in the area of reading and they're gradually developing skills, as time goes on, the expectation for what students are able to demonstrate grows. And in this case, we're seeing that Anna is starting to struggle with more advanced skills, relatively speaking. And so she's making progress, and the area of focus for her instruction and intervention can now shift away from things like phonemic awareness and focus more on these other areas where she still continues to have risk. This same process, from screening to instructional placement to progress monitoring to sort of rescreening, happens again the second half of the year. And so this is a circular process. It's a continuous improvement process as part of accelerating student learning. Some key points and considerations thinking about elementary school and assessment. We're fortunate in the early grades that there are numerous screening and progress monitoring assessments that exist, that have been rigorously studied, that have strong psychometric properties, especially when we're talking about kindergarten through third grade. So I encourage all of you to use one of those established measures for your screening efforts. It's true that we have more also in reading than we do in math, but the field has come a long way in the area of math. And as Sheila Alice noted in her overview this morning, it's really important that we're focused on critical skills when we're thinking about our efforts related to acceleration. And that's true for assessment too. And so you'll see our assessments focus on those critical skills, which is often why we have measures like screening assessments for reading and math and not other content areas. Not because those other content areas aren't important, just because reading and math play such a large role in all of those other content areas as well. We also know in elementary school that diagnostic assessments aren't necessary except for students who are working very far below grade level, because The curriculum tells us enough about what students need to learn, and so we can adhere to our curriculum standards, monitor student progress with skipping that diagnostic step for most students. When we choose a progress monitoring assessment, we want the assessment to be brief, a direct measure of student behavior, and proximal to the skill being taught. This is because we want our measures to be brief because we don't want to spend a lot of time monitoring progress, given that we need to do it more frequently than we administer other assessments. We want it to be a direct measure of student behavior so that we can use those data immediately to inform instruction. And we want the data to be proximal to what students are learning for the same reason. We want it to be something that is directly measuring what it is that we have been teaching so that it can inform that subsequent instruction. For example, when we're thinking about like a measure like DIBELS, for example, we can use the nonsense word fluency measure as a direct, proximal, brief measure of phonics to know what students are able to do expressively with a particular skill. And so there's been sort of some shifts in assessment where a lot of computer adaptive assessments are being used for screening and sometimes for progress monitoring. I would say that for screening, that can work well. A lot of those assessments have been validated and have very rigorous psychometric properties. The problem really comes when you're starting to think about students at risk and trying to monitor their progress, because many of those measures, particularly in the area of reading, are measuring student skill in a receptive way. And so we don't have, technology has not come far enough yet to allow us to, at least not to allow us to affordably assess students' expressive skills using technology. And this is because we want to, again, to use these measures and these data to immediately inform our instruction. So we want to have expressive measures of student skills that we need them to perform as part of demonstrating a skill. Like in reading, we want students to be able to read words and decode words. And so they need to know the letter sound correspondences that make up words or comprise words on their pathway to becoming proficient readers. And so we want to measure their ability to do just that, not their ability to identify a sound when someone else says it, which would be a receptive skill. We want to measure their expressive skills doing this so that we can really proximally know what students are able to do to inform our instruction. Another major point for elementary school is that prevention is key as part of accelerating student learning, particularly for historically disadvantaged groups that may not have access to the same learning opportunities as more advantaged peers, including students of color and students with disabilities. And so we really strongly adhere to a prevention-oriented frame, particularly in elementary school, to try and prevent these gaps from ever existing. Once they exist, they're harder to close and they grow over time. So this prevention piece is critical. Transitioning to middle and high school and thinking about how assessment works to accelerate student learning in secondary settings, we want to use our available data to screen students into tiers of instruction and intervention, much like we do in elementary school, but recognizing that there aren't necessarily screening assessments available that have been validated for screening students into tiers of instruction and intervention. So we can use some summative data in this case to help us in the fall to place students into appropriate levels of instruction and intervention, and also prior course completion data to help us make these decisions. Curriculum standards and data from diagnostic assessments inform the specific focus of instruction and intervention. So this is a little bit different from elementary school. Then instruction focuses on simultaneously remedying skill deficits related to critical skills and advancing student knowledge relative to grade level content standards. And I'll talk a little bit about how we use our data to do that. And then we also routinely collect progress monitoring data to inform decisions about reteaching or reviewing content and student preparedness to move on to more advanced skills. That's not to say that if we have data that suggests that a student is still struggling in an area that we stop moving on. It's that we think about how we need to reteach or accelerate learning related to that critical content that the student needs in order to access the subsequent instruction as part of our approach to accelerating student learning. So I'll give you another case example here. Again, we're talking about middle and high schools for secondary school. In this case, it's a high school example. So Juan is a 9th grade student in Portland, Oregon. At the end of 8th grade, he scored at level 2 in mathematics on the Smarter Balanced assessment, which Oregon uses as their state test. In 8th grade, Juan took pre-algebra and passed the class, but had a grade of a C. So he's sort of barely passing pre-algebra. His school does not have access to a screening assessment system for mathematics. So instruction and intervention is then based pretty much solely on state assessment data and prior course completion. Similar to an elementary school context, Juan's school meets to review prior year data for their students in their MTSS data team meeting and determine a level of support based on the available resources. In this case, Juan will be placed in algebra, so the course following pre-algebra, and taught using the district adopted math program. He'll follow the course sequence that he needs to graduate from high school, which we know again goes pre-algebra, algebra, and so forth. So we're keeping him on track toward graduation and preparedness for post-secondary opportunities. But we are also recognizing that Juan is struggling to master mathematics content. So his teacher is going to administer a teacher-designed diagnostic assessment because the curriculum that has been adopted doesn't have one built into it. The teacher is going to administer that assessment to determine the specific skills Juan is struggling with and those that he's already learned. The diagnostic assessment then will include critical content that lead into success or proficiency with algebra content, which we know include things like rational number operations and whole number operations that have a tendency to slow down a student's ability to learn and grapple with the abstract content of algebra if they are not well informed and fluent with those skills. Based on the results from the diagnostic assessment, Juan's teacher identifies that he has a strong grasp of whole number operations, but struggles with rational number operations. Looking at the class data, the teacher recognizes that Juan is one of a dozen students that are demonstrating the same difficulty. So she structures her algebra class to provide whole group instruction on new algebra content, reserving a third of the class time for rotating instructional groups and independent practice time that allows for differentiation to address the varied skill needs of students in our class. Juan's differentiated group instruction and independent practice will focus on those skills that he is struggling with that are preventing him from making progress in pre-algebra and algebra, which includes rational number operations. He gets regular feedback from his teacher, and additional practice is needed to support his mastery. Then, at the end of each class session, the teacher asks students to complete an exit slip to assess their knowledge of the key standard taught that day, to make sure that students grasped what she taught in that day's lesson related to algebra content so that she can monitor student progress and reteach content as necessary to support student learning. And then at monthly data team meetings, the teachers are reviewing both the mastery data from exit slips and unit mastery tests to make instructional adjustments and determine where more support might be needed for students. And this sort of combined approach is really critical in middle and high school when students are far behind, identifying the barriers to their ability to move on with instruction and intervention and targeting those critical skill areas, like in this case, rational number content, while still focusing on grade level content and moving the student forward so that they're not falling further and further behind their peers. So stepping back with middle and high school, some key points and considerations are that there are many fewer assessments available that demonstrate strong technical adequacy evidence. So we have to go back to what one of our guiding principles is, which is we have to use the best assessment available to support us in answering the question or serving the purpose for which we're using that assessment. Sometimes that's going to be teacher created materials, sometimes that's going to be curriculum created materials. But if there is a standardized, established measure available, that would be your best choice for measurement, assuming it meets your needs and answers your questions. Another key point for secondary school is that the holes in student skills are more frequent and warrant diagnostic assessment for students who are working below grade level expectations so that you can pinpoint instructional need and more efficiently accelerate their learning. And then differentiation based on diagnostic data is critical for students who are struggling to meet grade level expectations, which often requires a simultaneous focus on remediation and curriculum aligned instruction. And it sounds to me like you have numerous resources available to help you think about remediation and curriculum aligned instruction to support students in accelerating their learning on that side of things. So we're going to pause and reflect again based on the content that I've presented and discussed today. I want you to consider your own context, grade level, the content you work with, etc. What types of, you're thinking about two questions. What types of assessment can you better leverage to accelerate student learning? And two, what is your plan for identifying and implementing assessments to help you achieve student goals? So take about a minute to think about those things, jot down some notes, and then we'll continue. Okay, so I hope that you have some ideas based on the content we presented. If you don't, I'm also sharing another resource with you related to thinking about your assessment and your assessment plan. One thing that we don't want to do with assessment is have a ton of assessments, a ton of screening assessments, a ton of diagnostic assessments, and none of our other types of assessments. We want to have a sort of a balanced assessment system. So it's a worthwhile exercise to think about the different assessments that are being used in your context, what they're being used for, and how they're being used. So that includes identifying the measures, what technical adequacy evidence exists for them to make sure you're using the best available measures for the purpose for which you're using them. The timeline for administration, what kind of students are going to be assessed? So is it just tier 1 students? Is it students who are receiving intervention? What does that look like? Who's sort of your resident expert on the assessment? So who knows the ins and outs of the assessment system, how it's been developed, what it looks like, could train people to actually administer the assessment should that be needed. Assessment team members, so who's actually going to conduct the assessment, what training looks like and when it's received, how often that training occurs, if there's any plan for training or retraining new people that are coming into your school setting, how data are going to be entered from the assessment, the funding needs, funding source. You might also add in here a timeline for review of those data to make sure that those data are being used, which is another critical guiding principle of assessment for acceleration. And an example of this filled out, this happens to be a K through 3 reading assessment plan, but it identifies the measure or measures that are being used. I have seen people start to fill these kinds of grids out and they find out, wow, we have like 5 different screening assessments that we're using. And some of them we're not looking at the data at all, or sometimes we're trying to use both. And that just doesn't really make sense in the context of acceleration for student learning. So this is another example for you. And then closing out today, I have a number of resources that I want to draw your attention to. I mentioned the infographics earlier in the presentation from the National Center on Improving Literacy that describe different psychometric properties. The website for the National Center on Improving Literacy is there. The National Center on Intensive Intervention looks at a range of studies that have been done on measures to give you very rigorous information about whether or not an assessment has been validated for a particular purpose. Note that that's what the National Center on Intensive Intervention is giving you is information about those studies and how good the measures are at meeting sort of established standards, but there's still some decision making that you need to engage in when you're reviewing any of those websites, again, like the National Center on Intensive Intervention, but this also applies to the What Works Clearinghouse and the Evidence for ESSA site, in that even if the psychometric properties are very good, there may be other reasons that you'll choose one assessment over another, including things like cost, time it takes to administer, proximal nature versus distal nature of the assessment to what it is that you're trying to assess. So you have to think about some of those things as you're screening measures on their websites. The U.S. Department of Education also provides a number of different resources, or highlights a number of resources related to assessment. And then there are some university-based centers that do a good job identifying information about assessments, sometimes in some cases host assessments, and also how to link assessment data to instruction and intervention. And that includes the University of Oregon Center on Teaching and Learning, the IRIS Center, which is housed at Vanderbilt, the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk, the Meadows Center, Sharon Vaughn, if you attended her session, she's affiliated with that, so directs that center. And then the Florida Center for Reading Research also includes numerous resources, in this case related to reading specifically. So I'm going to stop there. I want to see if there are any questions, and I think Melissa's going to help facilitate the question asking process.
Yeah, so thank you, Nancy. We have a couple questions that have come in through the chat, and feel free to add more folks as we go. A couple questions came up when you were doing the Anna example, the first grader. One was, do we collect progress monitoring data more frequently for students receiving more intensive intervention, like Tier 3 supports?
Yeah, and that's part, yes, we do. And that's part of matching that intensity of assessment to the intensity of intervention. So if we're delivering a really intensive, say 60-minute Tier 3 intervention to students, we don't want to wait several weeks before we're monitoring student progress. We want to have probably weekly measures of progress for that student so that we can adjust more quickly, because it's a lot of effort and resources that are going into the delivery of intervention which warrants that additional assessment.
Great, thank you. And then again, with the Anna example, with the progress that was described in that example, could it be that the student was just getting better at taking the test because she was more had more practice with that format?
I would probably say no. I mean, it's possible, but these measures have been validated with large samples of students that would include a student like that. And so those students have been basically represented in the sample. And so if you felt that the student was having, an off day, or when you first administered the screening assessment, perhaps you would administer another probe. There are practice activities that are built into those probes when and if they have the potential to confuse a student. And so it's not likely that the student's prior experience with the measure was a major influence on their score in those in the assessment.
Great, thank you. Then hopping up to the secondary, there were a couple questions. If you're working with secondary students and the intervention program you have has a placement test in it, does that eliminate the need for a diagnostic assessment for these older students?
Likely it does. I mean, that instructional intervention, if you're adhering to the curriculum and you know that curriculum is aligned with the standards that students are expected to demonstrate at the end of the year, using the placement test from that intervention program acts as a diagnostic assessment for you. So you're not having to create one. If you know that curriculum is constrained in some way, it's not teaching all of the skills that students are expected to learn, then you might want to have a supplemental diagnostic assessment if you're going to provide additional supplemental intervention to the student focused on those other skills. So
matching that assessment to the intervention you're planning on providing. So
exactly. And the standards that you want to make sure that the student is meeting.
All right. And then you mentioned mastery assessments a few times throughout as part of the progress monitoring that could be done. If you're working in a program that does not have mastery assessments, what would you recommend that people do?
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend that these are created then. So in the secondary frame, a lot of times teachers work collaboratively to create a mastery assessment, like a unit test, if it doesn't exist in the program, so that one teacher isn't bearing all of the burden of creating those assessments. But that's something that then you can use year after year after year with that particular program as you're teaching those units. In the early grades, it's a bit easier because the skills that you're focused on are a bit more straightforward. And so you might be a curriculum aligned mastery test in that it's something that is based on the particular curriculum you're teaching, or it might be just a quick measure of the specific skills you're teaching. So I gave the example in elementary school of collecting error data as a measure of mastery. And so I'm seeing whether or not a student is making errors with the letter sound correspondences that they're learning that day, or with the words that they're being taught that day, or the blending strategy that they're being taught that day, collecting those error data and using those data at the end of the lesson to provide additional practice and try and shore up students' skills in those areas where they're struggling. Similarly, in a secondary context, I can use these like exit tickets that are teacher created. They're based on what you taught that day, but they're very simple, brief, straightforward, really just getting at did my students who are leaving my classroom today understand what I taught them today? And that's a measure of mastery that we can use in very, very quickly, very formatively to support our learning and really focus on this acceleration issue.
Even turning it around right away and using it to start the next lesson the next day. Exactly. As a review and firming up those skills. I love it.
Yep.
Another question. So when you were talking about, this was I believe in the elementary, and we were talking about universal screening, benchmark assessments, and all students being assessed, and then in the winter assessing all students, because you don't want to assume that just because they were level of risk was low in the fall that remained the same in the winter or spring. The question was, if a student has historically been at benchmark level for screening for like multiple years, would you still recommend screening 3 times a year, given the need for instruction versus the balance of instructional time versus assessment time?
Yeah, I mean, I probably would, mostly because it's most efficient to do that, and then you still have that data. You can be very, very certain. You may make decisions in your context based on really knowing a student over many, many years, that's not the best use of your time and resources for whatever reason. I think that's okay. You just run the risk of that student potentially falling behind and not having caught them. And then also, as you start deviating for particular students, your assessment plan gets a little bit less standardized, and you run the risk of things, of your assessment system kind of going awry. So I think it's more straightforward to just continue with your screening assessment for those students. Again, it gives you that sort of guarantee, so to speak, that the student is doing fine. And these assessments often are not taking a lot of time. The screening measures are intended to be brief, so that that's not an issue that it's really detracting from instruction.
Great, thank you. So if a school did not collect benchmark assessments at all last year due to the chaos that happened with COVID, would you recommend that they start with benchmark assessments at grade level in reading and math if that would have been their previous practice?
Absolutely. So again, this is part of accelerating student learning, is recognizing a lot of students who have been out of school are going to be far behind right now. But we want to know where students are relative to grade level expectations. And so that means you start at grade level, you give them their screening assessment. You're going to have if you're working in a traditional context where you're using a reading screening assessment like DIBELS, I can almost guarantee you're going to have a lot more students at risk than you have in past years. That doesn't mean that everyone needs a tier 3 intervention. That means that we need to really focus on the quality of instruction in tier 1 to support those students. That instruction is going to have to be more intensive in tier 1 than it normally would be for all students. And then supplemental intervention will be a resource-based decision where you're having to decide what resources do you have available to intervene with the most students that you can to catch them up. And if you're doing that well, you should start to see those data shift and the learning accelerate.
Great, thank you. And then another question came through. You talked about how universal screeners are kind of that global outcome measure that likened to the thermometer or the weight as a indicator of overall health. The question came through about how closely do the screening measures and progress monitoring measures need to align?
Yeah, and so for the screening assessment is, as I said, a risk measure, and so it's predicting out toward a comprehensive assessment that's administered at a much later time point. That's how the measures have been validated. So we know that screening measure is telling us about risk. It's easier to validate a screening measure, so where you're predicting out that sort of global risk. for progress monitoring that we want to be more instructionally relevant, those things can be not aligned. So you can have an unaligned screening and progress monitoring system. I think that complicates things. A lot of systems right now are trying to be all-encompassing. So you'll have a measure like STAR or iReady, or a lot of the computer adaptive assessments that are pretty good screening measures in a sense that they're validated toward an outcome measure. That's a little more tenuous in the early grades because those measures, again, are measuring generally receptive reading skills instead of expressive reading skills. And often they're being validated against measures that aren't the best choice of outcome measure. So usually when in validation studies, the psychometric properties, third grade and beyond, are very good because they're using the state assessment as the outcome measure. In K1, 2, they don't have the state assessment as an outcome measure. And so it's kind of a hodgepodge of things that they're validating against often, not always, but often. So in this sort of context of aligning your screening measures and your progress monitoring measures, I think that's actually really important in the early grades to do that, in part because screening is forming the baseline to which you're going to compare progress. And if those are not aligned, you're kind of comparing apples and oranges. And so essentially, if you have a screening measure that's not aligned with your progress monitoring measures, when you go to progress monitor for the first time, that's really going to be your baseline for all of the subsequent comparisons, because that's the only way you can make that comparison. So my recommendation is that those things stay aligned. Again, there are some problems with computer adaptive assessments in the early grades. The problems that I see with those assessments across this grade span is that often they're time intensive. So a progress monitoring assessment is 30 minutes instead of 1 or 2 minutes. Mm-hmm. So again, when we're thinking about resources and how we're allocating time until the assessments and the technology gets better, I think staying with more traditional measures is a better way to go with progress monitoring measures.
Makes sense. All right, and the last question I've been asking everybody: what is one book on your professional reading list for this summer?
I'm engaging a lot in work related to reading and dyslexia, so I haven't yet read. I think I'm probably going to totally mess it up, but Reading at the Speed of Sight.
Yeah.
Mark, yeah. So nice. I'm going back and reading that this summer.
Wonderful. Well, we thank you so much for your time today and all the great information. Lots of thanks in the chat today and compliments for the great information you shared.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks so much. It was great to see you, Melissa, and to be here with you all.
Thank you so much.
Bye.